I'm Mike Jang. I'm a tech writer for a company called ForgeRock. We make identity relationship management software. Well, that's what the marketers tell me to say. What that means is that we have our own web apps. That means I have to do my dives into JavaScript and JSON and figure out what the developers in my office are doing. I'm the one writer in an office of about 25, so I've got plenty to do. I want to share my lessons learned with you, so any of you should be able to write at least READMEs that help deployers use your web apps. With that in mind, how many people are developers here? Can you stand up? Thank you all for coming. It's great to see this kind of interest in documentation. Next, are there any QA people here? Wow, they all sit down. Well, when I first started at ForgeRock, my site boss told me, Mike, you're the first line of QA because you're the first guy to test the product as it comes out of the developers. Are there any other writers here? Wow. Oh, okay. Your chance to stand up. Thank you for coming. Have I missed anybody? Anybody else need the chance to stand up? Okay, that's great. I've covered it all. Before I continue, I should share something of my biases. I've been writing about open source software since the start of the millennia. Starting mostly on Linux for the past 3 years on ForgeRock software, which is open sourced under a license called the CDDL. And I've always taken the point of view of the deployer. I try to empathize with them. I try to do what they would do to put software into production. And every now and then, I push my developers a bit. If they say, Mike, I want you to document these 50 steps to installation, I tell them, no, you've got to give me an easy button. It's best if I could say /install is all you have to do to get things up and running. So with that in mind, my title, Help Deployers Run Your Web Apps, my original title, and it still applies, is 10 Steps to a Better README. I'll go through the fundamentals of what you need to cover in your documentation. And as for deployers, that's your audience. And I would split them out into 3 categories. Number 1 being admins. In your ideal world, it's mostly developers here. It's admins who have DevOps experience and are able to do a little bit of scripting and a little bit of coding. And that's great when that's your audience. But you have to remember, there are admins out there who got their job with a certification. So you've got to respect what they do as well. And if you told me that venture capitalists and analysts were interested in web apps a couple of years ago, I would have said you're crazy. But we're here in the center of the venture capital world and also the world of analyst journalism. Yes, they have some technical orientation. If you gave them enough time, they could even read the code. But they don't have a lot of time. So with that in mind, I did a search the other day for the term, just read the code. I got over 300,000 results. I looked at some of the results. One in a README, another in a README, another in a README. I thought, seriously? A developer who says just read the code, they want people to actually consider their project? Well, to be fair, there are benefits to self-documenting code. I don't know how legible this is, but if you can read it, you can see that it illustrates our self-service features for password reset. You can see our code for where we put in Google CAPTCHA for password policy parameters and so on. But put a few of these files together, We have over 70,000 lines of code in our product. And I think self-documenting code is just like human DNA. I mean, this is simpler in many ways. You have 4 different kinds of proteins, 16 combinations. If you're a geneticist, you know what these combinations mean. But put it all together in a human genome, you need a bit of help to understand it. And that starts with good documentation. Just as a bit of warning about documentation, I'll go into this. If you put too much code into it, it's going to start looking like the front page of the New York Times from 1914. Tracy this morning showed us how they changed their code to make things more readable. You can do the same. So people here, they're at least interested in creating documentation for their project. How do you do it? Do you start like a Hemingway, writing things down? Do you do a selfie? Do you create a YouTube? It doesn't matter as long as you start, whatever process you use. These are the basic steps I say you need to cover. I'll cover each of these one by one. So the need. Why your software? In the open source community, we say good software scratches that itch. That's my dog Katie scratching her itch. Great software helps a lot of people scratch that itch, solve the problem with the software that you have. And when you talk about your software, that's your opportunity to tell the world, hey, I got great software. It solves my problem doing A, B, and C. And you can go further. Linus Torvalds, the guy behind the Linux kernel, did this well in the early 90s. That was the time when big corporations were about to take Unix away from everybody, or at least charge big bucks for it. So he said, hey, we need a community operating system. There's this new project. I have a Linux kernel. He did it in a single email. We listened, and the world was forever changed. When you present a need, keep it simple. Use a short declarative sentence. My web app, verb, feature. It can be that simple. As a writer, I prefer that you use an active verb, but if you have to be, verbs are okay as well. Here are some examples of my need statements for different kinds of products. MariaDB, if you're familiar with it, is the GPL replacement for MySQL. Linux outperforms Windows. Hybrids reduce carbon dioxide. REST, I think most people here believe, is simpler than SOAP. And this is sort of like the pickup line. You've attracted people and they're here to listen, and they're ready to listen to your prerequisites. You're saying, hey, if we're going to continue this relationship, you need to know this about my project. What do you need? If you really need that 32 gig of RAM, or need to say that my software only runs on Windows 7, this is the time to do it. And when you do it, set up a checklist. People can then see, okay, let's check these off and say, I'm ready to install this web app. And for installation, my definition of that is, what does it take to get a deployer to hello world? Something simple. I mean, it's not yet functional, but if you say, Mike, it's going to take 50 steps to get there, I'm going to tell you no. If you want your project to be adopted, you need an easy button. Yes, that might mean a little additional work on your part, but it's worth the trouble. I think the Nginx project has done an excellent job of telling people, hey, you've gotten to hello world. Congratulations. If you want to go further, here's our documentation. If you want your hand to be held, here's how you can get support. Now that you've gotten to Hello World, the next step is configuration. We have Hello World. The next logical step is Hello Mars. You want that to be straightforward as well. I think the Apache project does an excellent job of that in their HTTPD configuration file. They have sample code that illustrates how you can set up a new virtual machine on your server, or a new virtual website, pardon me. Once you get people to Hello Bars, then you can say, hey, you've got a universe of possibilities to conquer, or a galaxy. This is where you can start saying, this is my code. Here's your use case. In this particular case, how do you set a password policy? Point them to your code by file and say, hey, this is what you can do. But my tip here is don't document everything. Just tell them what's needed for the particular use case. If you document everything, you start thinking, oh my God, this is like the New York Times. And you don't want that. Going further, another code sample. We use RESTful interfaces as well. Thus, the bottom line is a openidm.create function. OpenIDM is the name of our product. And we have a create function with certain parameters. If you think that helps deployers customize your project to their needs, document it. Describe the functionality of that. And speaking of REST calls, have a practical use for it. The use I'm about to illustrate is a REST call that adds a new user. And yes, you can do it with a curl command. I mean, you don't have to have anything fancy. After you illustrate what you can do with a simple use case, at that point you can say, okay, I've got all these endpoints, all these actions you can take with that endpoint, and here's what happens. That part is good for automated API documentation, but only after you have real use cases. And just to make the point of curl, here's a REST call we illustrate straight from our documentation. And here's some endpoints we say, hey, you can take the REST call and go further. Once you have the example, you can say, go to town. You can use our REST interface for all kinds of things. But all those code samples might be too much for part of your audience. Sometimes they say, hey, if you can just give us a UI, we'll be better off. And if you create a UI for your web app, your salespeople will love you. Analysts will say, wow, they know how to do this. But one thing I'm finding with a UI, we've recently added one to our web app, is when customers use it, they just start clicking. So I'm having to illustrate a use case and link it to our configuration files. Hey, if you've done this, you want to check your configuration file, and if it has these points, it should work for you. But if it doesn't, you've made a mistake. And this is another case where you can put together tips and tricks, or pardon me, pre-configured use cases. You have a use case, say, adding a bunch of users to a system. You can preset a bunch of configuration files and say, hey, just add these configuration files to our code or copy over what we have, and our system will help you do use case 1, 2, or 3. After you show them your use cases, Those admins with DevOps experiences, and I'm finding they're in the majority, will want to tinker with your code, assuming you're open source. They'll say, okay, what do we do to build your product? You could go into the gory details and say you got to change your POM file or a make file. And yes, my last line here is how I used to have to rebuild the Linux kernel back around 2002. But that's too much. Again, I show the easy button. If you can say, hey, if you tinker with our code and run this command to compile things into a binary, you've made life easier for your deployer. Now that we've covered build, next is troubleshooting. Say you've required Java 8 on your system, and at some point you accidentally set up a VM with Java 7. You found a NPE and thought, oh, I forgot to install the right version. Those are the things that go into an FAQ. And that doesn't necessarily cover everything. That's your opportunity to say, hey, we're a commercial enterprise. You can purchase some support. But when you get into that in an open source community, you're inviting contributions. Contributions in open source, we say, is like herding cats. But you've got to set out the structure. Tell people how they can contribute, how they can register for your bug reporting system. Tell them how to contact you. Give them a message board. Give them a way to talk to each other. You set up a community. You set up ways for people to say, hey, your software can be improved or your documentation can be improved. All the better. But that goes into your documentation as well. Your result, this is our cat. Sometimes you feel like a community isn't quite happy, but as long as they're interested and they've read through your documentation and participate, you've done your job. One thing everybody, well, perhaps lawyers like, but I'm not a lawyer, is licensing. If you have an open source project, you've got to choose a license. Otherwise, you're going to be stuck with a closed source copyright. And if you're an open source type of person, you don't want that. Fortunately, GitHub provides a guide to choosing a license. They have a variety of open source licenses and explanations at choosealicense.com. Whether or not you choose an open source or closed source license, in your code, be sure to update it every time you change it in a new year. Update the year. Copyright law depends on the year you put in each of your code files. Upgrades. I know I'm always troubled when I have to do an upgrade, thinking, oh my God, I have to back things up and make sure things are put into place. That's when you need a changelog. Then people can assess, is it worth the trouble? But sometimes you need an upgrade for that one more feature. On the left is a 767 freighter. On the right is a 767 AWACS. Note the radar dome on top. When you do an upgrade, you have a couple of options. You can tell people, do A, B, and C backup items, prepare items, add this code. People are going to get lost. They wouldn't want to do that upgrade. And if it's a security upgrade, you might get in trouble. Once again, I point to the easy button. If you want your deployers to keep their builds of your software up to date, you gotta help them. And those are the 10 basic steps you need to help your deployers use your web apps. I put a star next to build requirements because sometimes that's best stated in an appendix, especially if you have to go into detail on that. So from a meta point of view, what are the lessons learned? Make sure you describe the need for your software. Why your software? Do the work required to make it easy for your deployers to do what you want them to do. Yeah, that takes a lot of scripting, a little extra work, but if you have to describe 50 steps instead of /install or some other script, everybody's going to make mistakes no matter how good the documentation is. And help your deployers by illustrating useful ways to customize your software. Find real use cases that are good for your customers and tell them how to get your software to meet those use cases. And that's it. I went a little faster than expected, but this is the last session. So I'll take questions.
Can you show us an example of a really great readme online somewhere? Because mine is not, that's for sure.
I mean, I like the Apache readmes, but that's a little big and comprehensive, but it breaks things down into sub readmes in different areas. Any other questions?
So for these API docs, are you keeping the docs along with the code as comments, or how are you kind of building that stuff and keeping them up to date?
Right now, we do it by hand. We're in the process of converting it so we have some automated building of API docs that give us endpoints and descriptions. But that stuff essentially goes into our appendix because if you put it in the main body of a doc, it's going to overwhelm people without a valid use case.
Is 1 to 10 a necessary order that you recommend, or?
Not necessary. I mean, but, except for 1, put that first. Tell people why they need your software. It's your pickup line.
Any thoughts on scaling this out when you've got like dozens or hundreds of projects you want to do this on, and like how to actually like do this at scale when you've got like lots of projects you want to make sure have really great documentation and like coordinating as a team to make sure you're.
If you've got a substantial organization with a lot of different projects and you want some consistency between them, set it up with the way you want a customer to do things. The typical process is getting started, an installation guide, an administration guide, and a reference guide. Any other questions? We're doing an in-house tool that's Swagger-like. Swagger-like, we're doing some coding with some basic Swagger code to fit our product. Well, thank you very much. I know I'd like a drink, and so I'll be up on my way up to the atrium shortly.